Have you ever been frustrated with God because he wouldn't do what you wanted him to do? I don't know about you, but in my opinion, that makes life frustrating. I mean, sometimes I just don't want God's help. I want God's cooperation. I want him to cooperate with the future that I've already planned. I want him to move the pieces where I think they belong. In fact, I want him to change the circumstances that I think need changing. And when he doesn't, I'm just going to tell you, I get frustrated. You know, I think we've all struggled when God didn't respond the way we wanted him to. Maybe you wouldn't even describe yourself as a religious person today. Maybe you're still trying to figure out what you believe about God. You know, most of us have had opportunities that we've looked at what was happening in our lives and just thought, you know, if God is really there, then why isn't God doing something? You know, we already know how the story ends, or how it should go. We know what needs to change. We know which door needs to open and which problem needs to disappear. We even know which person needs to, well, just finally come around. We want control over outcomes that simply refuse to cooperate with us. I mean, maybe it's your health. The test results have already been posted, but the doctor hasn't called you yet. I mean, you've looked at the numbers. I mean, you've looked at it 3 times, even though you're not really sure what they mean. And your mind is just already running through every possible scenario that's out there. Let me ask you a question. What do we do when we ask God for one outcome and life hands us another? You know, maybe for you it's work or money. I mean, the interview went great. They told you they would be in touch. You walked out thinking, man, I've got this. But days go by and nobody calls. Or maybe you already have the job, but the company has announced changes and, well, nobody will tell you whose position is safe. The bills are still coming. The mortgage is still due. The savings is dwindling. I mean, have you ever thought, God, I'm not asking for much. I need you to make this work. And when it doesn't work, don't we just start trying to move every piece ourselves? I mean, we ask questions like, who can I call? What can I sell? What can I change? What can I do to force this thing back into the plan that I had for my life? You know, for some, it's the family. You've had conversations with your kids. You've tried being patient. You've gotten angry with them. You've tried backing off, and you've even tried stepping in. And just nothing seems to be working. I mean, have you ever laid awake at night thinking, if I could just get them to listen, if I could just make them see what they're doing, if I could just change their heart, if God would just change their heart. Maybe it's your marriage. I mean, how long do you keep going and keep hoping when the person you love isn't changing? How long do you keep asking God to fix something when it feels like he's fixing nothing? Have you ever looked at your life and wondered, God, did I miss something? Why does it seem like you are allowing things I would never have chosen? So we get frustrated because, well, control feels safe. We want to believe that if we make the right choices, if we work hard enough, if we pray hard enough, if we plan carefully enough, or if we worry long enough, that we can somehow make life turn out the way we think it should turn out. But what happens when life doesn't turn out the way we think it should? What happens when circumstances refuse to cooperate? What happens when God refuses to cooperate with a plan that we wrote for him? What do we do when the God we want help from refuses to be managed by us? What do we do then? What do we do when we can't make God move the pieces that we want him to move? And what if the greatest struggle in these moments isn't simply that life is out of control, but that our life was never under our control to begin with? You know, we find ourselves resisting God because, well, we want to rule our lives the way we want our lives to operate. But the reality is that the Bible teaches that God's authority remains unchanged even when people resist his rule. Please don't miss that. God's authority remains unchanged even when people resist his rule. See, that matters because resistance can make it feel as though everything is out of control. You know, when the plan falls apart, when the diagnosis comes back differently than we hoped, when the relationship changes, when the job disappears, or when circumstances refuse to cooperate, we can begin to wonder who's really in control. And sometimes our frustration with God comes from the fact that God refuses to be controlled. See, we want him to fix what we want fixed. We want him to change what we want changed. And we want him to work according to the plans that we have already written for him. But Scripture gives us a very different picture of God. God is not struggling to maintain control. He's not waiting for circumstances to cooperate. And he's not weakened because somebody refuses to recognize his authority. And so here's the big idea that I want you to remember. I don't want you to miss this. In fact, I want you to write this down. Resisting God's authority never removes God's rule. Let me say that again. Resisting God's authority never removes God's rule. Your resistance to God cannot and does not diminish God's sovereign rule. Listen, you can disagree with God. You can question God. You can ignore God. You can even try to arrange your life as though God has no authority over it. But none of those things change who God is. See, our response to God's authority may change, but God's authority never does. Our circumstances may change, but God's sovereignty never does. And 1 Samuel chapter 5 gives us one of the strangest yet clearest pictures of this truth in the Bible. This passage, the narrative we're going to look at in a moment, really helps us understand. Let me give you a little bit of the backstory. Israel has just suffered a devastating military defeat. The Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant and carried it into their territory. And from the Philistines' point of view, this must have looked like more than a military victory. In fact, in ancient times, defeating another nation could be looked at, it could be interpreted as defeating that nation's God. So, when they carried the ark into the temple of their god, Dagon, they're making a statement. They were saying, our God won, your God lost. But they're about to discover something that they never expected. And I want you to see, dear friends, as we begin to look at this narrative, that God doesn't need permission to be God. God doesn't need permission to be God. See, the Philistines thought capturing the ark meant that they had captured Israel's God. They assumed that because they possessed the symbol connected with God's presence, then they now had Israel's God under their control. But again, God's sovereignty was never dependent on Israel's winning a battle. And it certainly wasn't dependent upon the Philistines recognizing who God is. God didn't become God when people acknowledged him. And he certainly didn't stop being God when people resisted him. Look at our narrative. 1 Samuel chapter 5, beginning in verse number 1. 1 Samuel 5:1 says this, and the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer unto Ashdod into the house of Dagon, and set it by Dagon. And when they of Ashdod arose early on the morrow, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. And they took Dagon and set him in his place again. Now I want you to notice what the Philistines do. They bring the Ark of the Covenant. They bring the Ark into Dagon's house and they set it by Dagon. In their minds, they've decided where Israel's God belongs. In fact, they've assigned him a place. Israel's God has now, in the minds of the Philistines, become a trophy. He's another trophy in Dagon's temple. And this is their way of showing that the God of Israel now stands beneath the authority of their God. But the next morning, Dagon's not standing over the ark. In fact, Dagon is lying face down before the ark. You know, there's something almost humorous about what happens next. The people who worship Dagon, they needed to pick Dagon up and put him back in place. In fact, think about it. The worshipers of Dagon had to rescue Dagon. May I just say this? Nobody needs to rescue the God of Israel. The Philistines thought God had been defeated because God's people had been defeated. But they were wrong. God's authority was never dependent upon his people looking successful. God didn't need their permission to rule, and God did not need their cooperation to rule. This is a powerful lesson that we must learn. And the sooner we learn this lesson, the better our lives will be. What stands against God cannot stand before God. What stands against God cannot stand before God. The first time Dagon falls, the Philistines apparently treat it like an accident. They pick him up, they put him back in the place where he belongs, and they go on with their day. But God is about to make the point unmistakable. Dagon's first fall could perhaps be dismissed. The second one could not. Let's look at it in our narrative in verse 4. 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 4 says this, And when they arose early on the morrow morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. There it is again. Dagon was fallen upon his face. The picture hasn't changed. Only this time, the image is shattered. Listen, this is not a story about two equal gods fighting to see who's a stronger God. In fact, the Bible doesn't present the Lord as barely defeating Dagon. The reality is that there was no struggle. Dagon never moved against God. Dagon only fell before God. You know, the Philistines can just keep putting Dagon back in place, but they can't keep him standing in the presence of the Lord. And that is the theological center of this strange story. Our resistance cannot turn God into an equal competitor. Our resistance does not lower God to whatever else we're dealing with. Listen, the Philistines can put the ark wherever they want, but they cannot put God wherever they want. The image they thought represented power is now lying broken on the floor, while the God they thought they had conquered, well, he never lost control. And what a powerful reminder. Appearances do not determine authority. A situation can look like God is lost without God having lost anything. A culture can ignore him. A nation can reject him. A person can resist him. Circumstances can seem completely inconsistent with what we thought God should allow. But none of those things remove the sovereignty of God. Dagon fell because God does not surrender his throne simply because somebody wants to occupy it. Which brings us to this truth. Moving the problem doesn't move God. Moving the problem doesn't remove God. Once Dagon is on the floor, the story shifts. The problem is no longer confined to the temple. Now the people of Ashdod begin experiencing the heavy hand of God, the Bible says. And instead of asking what their encounter with the Lord means, the Philistines decide that they just simply need to move the ark somewhere else. Look at our narrative, beginning in verse 6. 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6 says this, "But the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them of Ashdod, and he destroyed them, and smote them with emerods, even Ashdod and the coast thereof. And when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, The ark of the God of Israel shall not abide with us, for his hand is sore upon us and upon Dagon our God." You know, there's an important phrase in this passage. The hand of the Lord was heavy upon them. Dagon's hands have been broken off, but the hand of the Lord was still very much at work. The Philistines finally understand that what's going on here, that this wasn't an accident. They know whose hand is that they're dealing with at this point. But their solution is fascinating. They just moved the ark. I mean, it was in Ashdod. Then they sent it to Gath, and then they finally sent it to Ekron after the same thing happened in Gath. I mean, their strategy is basically, maybe the problem will just go away if we move it somewhere else. But may I just say this? Changing the location of the problem does not change the location of the Lord. Everywhere the ark goes, the Philistines were confronted with the same reality. The Lord is still God. They keep changing cities, but God doesn't change. They keep rearranging the circumstances, but his authority remains. And that is one of the greatest ironies of this chapter. The Philistines are moving the ark around as though they are in control of the situation. Well, every move simply demonstrates that they're not in control. God's sovereignty cannot be controlled. And that gets right to the heart of why this story speaks so powerfully into the frustrations that we have with God. We often assume that control comes from rearranging enough circumstances. I mean, if this changes, if that moves, if that person responds differently, if this door opens, if that problem disappears, then everything will finally be under control. But 1 Samuel 5 reminds us that control never belonged to the Philistines in the first place. And let me just say this to us. Control never belonged to you either. Control never leaves God's hands. And to those that are resisting God in their lives right now, there is a truth that you need to know. Resistance changes our experience with God, but not God's position over us. Resistance changes our experience with God, but not God's position over us. By the time the ark reaches Ekron, the Philistines are no longer celebrating a captured trophy. They're terrified. See, what began with confidence ends with desperation. Notice in our narrative, beginning in verse number 11, "Therefore they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, Send away the ark of the God of Israel and let it go again to his own place, that it slay us not and our people. For there was a deadly destruction throughout all the city. The hand of God was heavy there, and the men that died not there were smitten with emerods, and the cry of the city went up to heaven." Notice how dramatically the language changed. At the very beginning of the chapter, they took the ark of God. By the end of the chapter, they said, "Send the ark of God away." They thought they had captured God. Now they just want him gone. But here's what never changed throughout the entire story: God's position. When the ark was captured, he was God. When the ark entered Dagon's temple, he was God. When Dagon fell, he was God. When the Philistines moved the ark to Gath, he was God. When they moved it to Ekron, he was God. And when the entire nation wanted the ark sent away, guess what? He was still God. Their resistance, well, it changed their experience of Israel. But their resistance never changed the reality of Israel. And that is the distinction this passage forces us to see. See, we tend to think that if we resist long enough, then his authority will eventually loosen. We tend to think that if we ignore God, then maybe God's claim on our lives will become less significant. We tend to think that we want it to be true, that if we would just disagree with God, then maybe his truth will become negotiable. In fact, we tend to think that if we're frustrated enough with how God is running things, then perhaps we can replace his plans with ours. However, resisting God's authority never removes God's rule. Your resistance to God cannot diminish God's sovereign rule over your life. Listen, the statue bowed because God never stopped ruling. The cities of the Philistines panicked because God never stopped ruling. The ark needed no rescue because God never stopped ruling. Israel's failure didn't dethrone God. The Philistines' victory didn't diminish God. Dagon's temple could not contain God. And your resistance to God cannot control God. The God of 1 Samuel 5 is not asking permission to be sovereign. He is sovereign. So the next time that you feel frustrated because things aren't going your way, just ask yourself, what am I trying to control that I need to surrender to God? Because sometimes your frustration isn't really about what's happening around you. Sometimes your frustration comes from realizing that you can't make the situation turn out the way you want. That's hard. You want the doctor to give you the report that you've been praying for. You want your child to make better decisions. You want your marriage to get better. You want that employer to call you back. You want that promotion to come through. You want the bills to work out. You want the relationship to be restored. You want that person you love to change. And when none of those things happen according to your timetable and according to your plan, you can find yourself gripping tighter, worrying more, praying harder, not because you're trusting God, but because you're still trying to control the outcome. Maybe for you, control looks like constantly running the situation through your mind again. I mean, you replay that conversation over and over again in your mind. You check the bank account again. You refresh the email. You look at the test results one more time. You rehearse what you're going to say to your child or to your spouse or to your boss or to your friends, because you're convinced that if you can just say the right thing, or if you could just push the right button, or if you could just make the right move, then you can get everything back where it belongs. But what if the peace you're looking for won't come from getting everything under your control? What if peace begins when you acknowledge that outcome has never been outside of God's control? Now, listen, that doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you stop praying. It doesn't mean that you start becoming passive or irresponsible. In fact, surrender means you do what God has placed in your hands and you trust him with what he hasn't placed in your hands. And at some point, you must decide whether you're going to keep trying to hold together something that only God can. What are you going to do? Could you consider identifying one outcome that you've been trying to control and then deliberately place it in God's hand? Not 10 things, just one thing. Maybe for the next 7 days, every time your mind starts racing toward that situation, instead of trying to solve it again, just turn that moment into prayer. In fact, you could say what I refer to as the surrender prayer. Let me give it to you. The surrender prayer says this: God, I will do what you've asked me to do, and I surrender the outcome to you. It's that simple. God, I'll do what you asked me to do, and then surrender the outcome to you. See, the truth of this passage is that God doesn't need your circumstances to cooperate in order for him to remain God. He'll still be sovereign in whatever you're facing. So, what are you holding on to so tightly that God is asking you to place in his hands? You may not be able to surrender the situation once and never struggle with it again. In fact, you may need to surrender it every morning. You might even need to surrender it every hour, and that's okay. See, surrendering isn't pretending that you're no longer afraid. In fact, it's choosing to trust God while the fear is still present. Let me just remind you, you can resist God's authority, but your resistance will never remove God's rule. So instead of exhausting yourself trying to control what only God can control, just choose to surrender to God today. Because when you stop demanding that God follow your plan and you begin trusting that he is still ruling, then you can experience a peace that control never could give you. Again, surrendering to God turns frustration with God into faith in God. Imagine how different our lives would be if we stopped trying to control everything and just trusted God with everything. I mean, imagine the peace that could settle into our hearts. The test results could still be waiting. The savings account could still be shrinking. The plan that we were certain could still fall apart. I mean, with one phone call. We might face a diagnosis we never wanted or a failure might be uncertain. But God's authority is never uncertain. In fact, we could discover that surrender doesn't make life predictable, but it does make peace possible. Imagine what that kind of trust could do in our family lives. I mean, there'd still be difficult seasons. Marriages could still require hard conversations. Children could still make choices that just break our hearts. Aging parents could still need more care than we feel prepared to give. And finances could still become tight. Family relationships could still become complicated. But what if our homes were no longer shaped by our desperate attempts to control one another? What if fear stopped setting the emotional temperature of our families? You know what I think? I think our homes could become places where uncertainty doesn't automatically create panic, because we've learned together that God remains sovereign even when life feels uncertain.